Everybody, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Just take your seats. Thanks for coming this afternoon, and also thanks to everybody who's tuning in online. I'm Jonathan Cook. I'm with the Climate Change Office at USAID here in Washington. Very pleased to have the opportunity to introduce this Adaptation Community Meeting today with John Parker from Tetra Tech. First, quick announcement I just want to make for those of you who are regulars. We're not going to be doing a meeting in August, so we'll be back on track, I think, in September. Stay tuned for details on that one, but nothing in August. Hot, sweaty DC summer. So I'm very pleased to have John here today to talk about the project. You know, actually about a month ago, John and I were bouncing around Tanzania with another group of folks into water security. Actually spent a lot of time talking about the work that's being done under the Prepared project. They've done quite a lot that was actually very relevant for some of the water issues that we were looking at. And I think this new activity which John's involved with, the Sustainable Water Partnership, will be building on some of that work as it gets started in the next couple of months. So it's really interesting to hear a bit about Prepared. Today you're going to hear about some of the other aspects of Prepared. It's also done a lot of really interesting work on climate data and working to improve both the availability of that data to stakeholders in the region in East Africa, as well as how it gets used, how it gets translated into tools and products. So really interested to hear what John's got to say. Just a couple of words about John. He's currently serving, as I said, as the Deputy Director of the Sustainable Water Partnership, which is a USAID program, and he's also been very involved with a number of other climate programs in his time at Tetra Tech, including some work in Honduras, Central America, etc. So he's got a lot of expertise on climate, on water, and on development, and I think it'll be a really rich presentation, and we'll have lots of time at the end for Q&A. So no further ado, I'd like to pass the mic over to John. Thank you.
Do I need the mic? Okay. Let's turn it up. Thanks. Okay. Well, thanks, Jonathan. Appreciate that, and it's good to be here today. And thanks to the Atlas Project for the opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the work that has been going on the Prepared project. And I guess I'll start out by saying that I'm just the messenger here today. The real thinking and hard work that I'll be talking about is, the Prepared field team and the institutional partners that we've been working with. So they can't, of course, make it here today, so you're stuck with me. So bear with me. So the other thing that I'd like to point out is that the work that I'm going to be talking about is just one small piece of everything that Prepared has done. And during the Q&A, we can perhaps get into some of the other aspects of Prepared. But I'm going to be focusing on the work that was carried out related to the climate change adaptation component, and specifically on improving access to climate information. So to begin, I wanted to give a quick overview of the main institutional partners that are part of the Prepared project. So this includes the EAC Secretariat, which has the role of the regional policy coordination body for the East African community, and which covers 5 partner states: Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi. And within the EAC, there's the Lake Victoria Basin Commission, which has the goal for promoting sustainable development for the Lake Victoria Basin. ICPAC, IGAD Climate Prediction Application Center, their role is to promote climate services throughout the Greater Horn of Africa. FuseNet, USGS, and the program the Regional Center for Mapping Resources for Development support products. And then the Prepared project, the contract, Tetra Tech essentially serves as the main entity of all these partners here and facilitates all the work that is carried out on the project. project. So the approaches of regional programs and sort of the principles of regional programs and how that is different from what we know under a bilateral program. And these were the principles prepared really embrace. Working to harmonize the different policies and protocols. Policies, practices, and tools in support of transboundary management. A strong focus on capacity building of regional institutions, and supporting in a complementary role the work that was being carried out under bilateral and multilateral programs. And the key was, really to align with and support these regional institutions in everything we did as a means to facilitate long-term sustainability. So, as I mentioned, prepared is, there are other components that are part of prepared, and so there are three main components. One is climate change adaptation, the other is biodiversity conservation, and then the third is WASH. And there's a cross-cutting area of focus that's around water resources management, focusing particularly around the Lake Victoria Basin. I'm going to be focusing on the climate change adaptation component, as I mentioned, specifically the area of improving access to and sharing of climate information. I've listed here some of the key sort of areas of work that we carried out under climate change adaptation. I won't go through these in detail today, but we can talk about them more during the Q&A, and I can share more information, of course, subsequently. In terms of what we did related to improving climate information, the first step was we conducted a climate information user assessment, and this was led by CSIN, Columbia University's International Earth Science Information Network. And the purpose of this was really to enhance the understanding of the needs of end users, what information and products they were currently using, and the key gaps that existed between the products that were available and user demand. This was followed by an assessment of the existing products that were being offered by climate information providers to get a sense of what was already available in the region. And essentially, these two assessments, baseline assessments, they helped us to answer key questions of what climate information is currently being used, what constraints exist that impact the effective use of climate information, and what lessons and best practices enact using climate information in the East African community. And the goal of this was to develop this framework for what we call a climate information network. And I'll talk about what we mean by this a little bit later. But essentially, we look to develop a mechanism that helped to link climate information users and service providers together through a coordinated and collaborative approach. With targeted service providers, we implemented an approach called QSIP, Quality Service Improvement Plan, which is essentially a process that works to create a service culture in an organization, an improved focus on customers and quality of products, and identifying opportunities for practical and low-cost service improvements. And we can talk about that more later as well. So in terms of the Climate Information Network, the idea wasn't to create a formal structure or institution, but essentially through this process to better connect the providers of climate information in the EAC. So we're specifically talking about ICPAC, Met Services and WMO, RCMRD, FuseNet, and the East African Community's Climate Change Coordination Unit. These are the main providers of climate information in the EAC. Connect them with the end users to facilitate communication and information flows about climate and link this to decision making. So in the blue box, you can see some of the illustrative end users of climate information that we identified through our baseline assessments and that we're currently working with. So in terms of improving climate services and products, what did we do? So we developed, tested, and trained service providers on climate information tools, and I'll get into some of these tools a little bit later. We assisted the Tanzania Meteorological Agency to capture and digitize records from 12 temperature stations and 90 rainfall stations for over 30 years of records within the Tanzanian portion of the Lake Victoria Basin. So that was 14,530 records. We piloted QSIP with the Kenya Meteorological Department, ICPAC, and RCMRD. And in terms of the tools that I mentioned, one of them is called GeoClim. And so with support from FuseNet and USGS, we developed and rolled out GeoClim. And GeoClim is designed for climatological analysis of historical rainfall and temperature data. It blends ground station data with high-resolution satellite data. And so this is known as CHIRPS, Climate Hazards Infrared Precipitation with Stations. And the goal is to create more accurate gridded rainfall data sets. And so GeoClim helps to analyze seasonal trends and historical data. So with GeoClim, we trained a team at ICPAC, which really has the mandate as climate services within the broader Horn of Africa region. And they subsequently led trainings on GeoClim to meteorological departments throughout the 5 EAC partner states. So the 5 partner states were trained in GeoClim, and they contributed station data to help build these gridded data sets. And this was a 35-year data set that was developed. We developed the regional GeoClim data set that is now housed at ICPAC. So they, are the ones who, in terms of institutional sustainability, who are carrying on this work. Okay. And we're working with the regional WMO office and ICPAC to support GeoClim and integrate it with ClimSoft. We're also using GeoClim for a weather index crop insurance pilot in Kenya. And so, in addition to GeoClim, there were a number of other decision support tools that were developed. So GeoCough, which provides seasonal forecasts and early warning with at an improved spatial scale. GeoWRSI, which supports agricultural risk mapping. GeoMod, which provides downscaled future climate change scenarios. And then vulnerability index mapping, which is a geospatial tool which helps to basically create vulnerability maps. And I'll show some examples of these in some later slides. So this is an example of an output of GeoClim, which shows rainfall variability, looking at long rains and short rains and interannual variability in the East Africa region. And we also, as part of the USAID Tanzania WARIDI program, which is the Water Resources Integration and Development Initiative, supported WARIDI to develop rainfall trends for a 35-year period for the Rufiji and Wami-Ruvu basins in support of the Ministry of Water and Irrigation. And so as you can see, the southeastern portion of the Rufiji and Wami-Ruvu are particularly, they demonstrate significant declines in rainfall over this 35-year period. And so this is another example of an output that was produced by through GeoClim. So another tool that I mentioned we helped to roll out is vulnerability index mapping. This is something that was supported again by season, and this is an example of one of the outputs of the vulnerability index mapping that we did. So Essentially, we introduced and trained key institutions in the use of vulnerability mapping to identify climate and ecosystem hotspots. And the success of this approach has been demonstrated by the uptake of this tool by some of the key institutions, particularly RCMRD, which is working primarily on geospatial information and products. And they are now applying this tool throughout the region. Most recently, they were asked by the government of Malawi to help them and train them in the use of VI mapping for specific projects in Malawi. The tool is flexible and can be adapted to select indicators that are most of interest and relevant to stakeholders. So it's not, you see some of the indicators that were selected for this specific ecosystem hotspot analysis, but you can put any kind of indicator that's of interest into this kind of a tool to develop, to identify hotspots and to identify areas of vulnerability. So this here is an example of how this has been applied in Lake Victoria Basin to understand ecosystem hotspots, illuminating the vulnerability of the Mara Serengeti ecosystem. So you can see on the bottom right there that it demonstrates very high vulnerability, and that it allows you to basically identify that as a key area of focus for the development and implementation of specific interventions. So another aspect of our work related to data rescue, we worked with the Tanzania Meteorological Agency, as I mentioned, to capture and digitize 30 years of rainfall and temperature data from 96 stations around the Lake Victoria Basin in Tanzania. This map shows the location of those stations. And then finally, another example of how GeoClim and other tools that I've described have been used are in support of an area yield index insurance program. So the government of Kenya, with World Bank support, is supporting an area yield index insurance program. And so Prepared, using GeoClim, is adding climate information to help distinguish unit areas of insurance. So these are essentially the smallest administrative units within a similar farming system for the crop areas that are insured under this program. So it essentially allows you to set premiums, monitor real rainfall during the cropping season, and determine using GeoWRSI when the optimal time is to cut crops and determine the actual yields for each UAI. These actual yields are compared to the long-term average yields for the area to determine if farmers exceed or do not exceed the 80% threshold and therefore get paid for substandard yields for that season. So some of the main takeaways of this work under Prepared, and none of these are, I would say, are new, but they reinforce things that we already know. So generally, value-added products and services are more useful than station data. Products and services must be based on user demands and incentives. You need reliable data coverage for precipitation and temperature, and the gridded data sets is a significant accomplishment in this area. Users need to be ensured of data validity and credibility, and credibility comes from authorized and trusted meteorological organizations. So thank you. That's an overview of some of the work related to climate services and Prepared. So we can open it up to the questions and clarifications.
So, John, just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, thanks. If maybe you could talk a little bit about that last point you were sort of emphasizing again about matching user needs to sort of what's supplied. Presumably a lot of these products and these things came out of discussions with different stakeholders. Could you just talk a little bit about, in your view, what, in the view of Prepared, what that process has been like in the region? How has there been, an effort to actually kind of bridge that gap and understand user needs? Like, has that been part of the process, and how did it work, I guess?
Yes. So we're really done. understand what users asked for. And then in addition to that, did an assessment of what the existing products were in the region and try to understand, where the potential mismatch was. Two different groups in the room together, and this was all part of the climate information network activities that we were carrying out. And basically, through the Quality Service Improvement Program, tried to facilitate activities that created basically the service culture within the service providers. And, generally, and I'm sure that many of us in the room know, that kind of thinking with some of the meteorological agencies and other, climate information providers, it's not really part of, what they do. It's, they historically, it's been very supply side and very much focusing on, weather forecasts, but not thinking about what additional products can we create that really align with what, users are asking for and need. So, it was very much a facilitated participatory process that, over time, in some of these products that I was discussing here, I mean, those are the things that came out of what was, being identified by the end users as the types of things that they were looking for.
Great. Okay, so questions. So we got. So maybe we'll start over with Jeff and then work our way across.
Hi, Jeffrey with USAID. I'm really sorry I was late, and so you may have covered this. I'm just curious if you could maybe give an example of how the last point we were just talking about with respect to the project, really trying to pay attention to the user needs. Once that product was delivered to match the user needs, can you give an example of what the impact of that was? So you talked about the payouts with insurance, but are there other cases like farmers changing their, harvest cycles or planting cycles or anything along those lines?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. And one thing I haven't mentioned here is coupled with the climate services work, we carried out a number of, community-based climate change adaptation assessments, which were intended to really get that local level, understanding of what are the types of things that farmers and, local institutions most wanted in terms of climate services and products. And so we've done exactly what you're describing through those assessments, identified, the products that they need, and then facilitated, different things such as new crops being introduced, change in behaviors, water use efficiency measures, and so on, that came out of this process. And then related to that, as I mentioned, the regional institutions that we're working with, part of what their role is to really push these tools out to partner states and key ministries and those that are really looking for these kinds of products for their beneficiaries. So, as I mentioned, a regional project, in terms of boots on the ground implementation, it's a bit limited. So we work through these regional institutions who then in turn work with their partner states and help to really ensure that they're part of this. Yep.
Okay, so maybe we'll take two questions together. Just say your name and what age you have one.
Hi, I'm Kiran Jaguna. I'm an independent consultant. I'm curious about in the journey from turning these different disparate data centers or sources into an integrated service. What have been the infrastructural challenges, or perhaps maybe in that journey, like for example, you had mentioned 35 years worth of data. Improvements in infrastructure has probably helped because now in East Africa there's better broadband connections. I don't know whether that that has helped or whether there have been other challenges, infrastructure-wise. Physical infrastructure, but perhaps maybe even the personnel that use the infrastructure, training issues and things like that might have been challenges. I just want to hear your remarks on that.
That's a good question.
So, I mean, I would say in terms of physical infrastructure, one of the biggest constraints, and, you know, we tried to address it through our data rescue activity. I mean, rain gauging stations, you know, the data limitations that are out there and the infrastructure required to, you know, collect that data on a regular basis is significantly limited. And so, you know, that was really one of the main objectives of the data rescue activities, basically, you know, capture that data and help to digitize it, and then help, you know, in this case it was the Tanzania Meteorological Agency, help them to, you know, create some kind of, you know, element of sustainability in terms of their staff being trained in that kind of an approach. And, you know, we also supported to address elements of financial sustainability. So I would say in terms of the climate services piece, it was really, I mean, it's the infrastructure around, you know, data collection and management, which is, I would say, both the, you know, a physical sort of hard side as well as the soft side, which is, you know, everything related to information, knowledge, and management systems, and, you know, having, you know, an ability to create a portal or something that you know, allows people to access this information on a regular basis.
Hi, Ken Andrasco, freelance consultant. I have two questions. One, following directly up on that, I'm wondering about what the capacity for penetration of decision support tools is. So it's nice to build a tool, and when you work in East Africa, you meet with very talented people, but I always get the sense there aren't very many of them. And so I guess I'm wondering, how successful have you been in prepared in actually getting the use of decision support tools down beyond a year or two, and then they disappear? So that's my first question. Second one is on the insurance work. Looks really interesting. I guess I'm wondering, you must have a private bank or something involved providing the funds. How difficult was it to get them involved, and what is, and has it been successful so far? Have there actually been payments made after drought events or whatever, and what's the potential for scaling it up?
Great question. So the first piece, I mean, you know, as I mentioned, prepared, it's all about working through these regional institutions. So in terms of sustainability of these tools that we're talking about, GeoClim and the other related tools, those are now owned and housed by ICPAC, and they in turn have helped to train the meteorological agencies in these tools, and they now are using them as part of their, you know, portfolio of service offerings. So that was really, you know, a critical element of what our approach has been. In terms of the insurance piece, so one of our partners worked on basically private sector engagement and developing public-private partnerships. And actually, the insurance activity that I mentioned came out of this PPP approach. And so, you know, in terms of the specific insurance agencies that are involved in this, and this is a pilot activity, it's Jubilee Insurance is the main one, and it's still kind of at the early stages, so there haven't been any payouts. But it's, you know, it's really embracing a sort of PPP and kind of private sector engagement approach to, you know, to bring on insurance companies as part of the process.
Move over here, so Kevin.
Hi, Kevin Coffey from USAID. I was curious, the QSIP that you mentioned, can you describe, is it a physical thing, or like, can you describe what it is and how it's implemented?
So QSIP, it's a process, and actually it was first created under a local governance project that the Tetra Tech ARD implemented, I think, in the Philippines in the early 90s. And so it's basically, it's a participatory process where, you know, there are, I think, 6 steps in it, and I don't recall exactly which, you know, what are all the steps, but essentially it helps to create the service culture within an organization. So, you know, helping them to focus what they do and what they offer around what the clients and customers are asking for. So in addition to, you know, this being rolled out in this case on the climate services side of things. We've used it to address issues of non-revenue water, working with water utilities. I mentioned the, you know, the local governance example, but it's an approach and a process that, you know, could be used regardless of the sector. And it's really, you know, it's about changing the behavior and the mentality of that organization to really focus on supporting, you know, client demands and needs.
Is that something that was developed through the project or did it exist?
So QSIP was developed, as I mentioned, it was under this USAID funded project in the Philippines, implemented by Tetra Tech ARD, and we adapted it on Prepared, you know, specifically to work with climate information providers.
Is there like a booklet?
Yeah, I can. I mean, if you give me your contact information, I can share and the process and also some examples of where it's been applied in the field.
Okay, next question.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm Becky from USAID. I'm interested to learn a little bit more about how the partnership works. And maybe you can even go back to one of the slides that shows all the partners. But I'd like to hear kind of what were the benefits of having these different organizations working with each other, and are they collaborating to produce climate services, or are the individual partners producing their own products? And, you know, so just kind of the nature of that collaboration. And then I'm also interested with Tetra Tech as kind of playing a secretariat role, or what collaborative or coordinating role when the project closes out, and what the plans are for sustainability, and what you kind of see as the future for these organizations and how they'll move forward with this work.
Great questions. So the design of Prepared, there's the program aspect and then the project aspect. And the project is the contract, as I mentioned, that you know, Tetra Tech is implementing. The program, so the EAC and the LVDC have direct funds from the USAID Kenya and East Africa mission to implement certain activities under Prepared, you know, as part of the overall scope. ICPAC similarly also has an assistance agreement, you know, with their separate sort of pot of funding as part of the program. FuseNet and USGS, there's a buy-in, and then RCMRD, as part of Servier, has, you know, their own scope, which, you know, was aligned to also support some of the activities that Prepared was doing. So the design, it was challenging. I mean, you know, anytime you have a number of regional institutions and specific sort of protocols and differing mandates, you know, within those institutions, to bring them all together around a common vision, you know, it's difficult to do. I would say that, you know, and now we're in year 5 of implementation. The project closes out in December 2017. We started up December 2012. Over time, it's paid off, but it takes, you know, I would say a year or two to ensure that there is the institutional buy-in to get everybody, you know, on the same page and supporting what the overall project is about, and you know, the goals and objectives. And especially, I would say, you know, when each has a separate sort of scope of work, and they're, you know, it's tough to kind of, you know, fit all those pieces together. So, you know, the way we went about it is, you know, during the first month of implementation, we brought everyone together and carried out, you know, a participatory work planning workshop, and, you know, explained, you know, the objectives, and, you know, got an understanding of what everyone's, you know, perspectives were, and ensured that those were incorporated into the overall work plan. But there's another layer that I haven't mentioned here, which is the partner state level. And so each partner state within the EAC, and as I mentioned, there are 5, you know, they also have a role in, particularly in the implementation of the work that Prepared does. And their perspective is that they want on-the-ground implementation, which on a regional program, it's not typically what a regional program does. So we've tried to balance, sort of the more, the kind of higher level transboundary type activities with an understanding that, at the partner state level, which is, they're the clients of the EAC, that they really want to see tangible on the ground benefits. And so we've been, we've worked through, particularly under grants under contract, to implement on the ground activities that, that address the partner state's concerns. But a lot of different actors, a lot of different institutions, and, it can become challenging, but over time it definitely has paid off, and I think that, Prepared as a result is, has been quite successful in that regard. So whether or not there's a follow-on to Prepared, that depends on what the mission, ultimately decides to do. The EAC has continued funding from the mission to continue a broader suite of activities that go beyond just, the type of work that Prepared has been supporting. So there is, that piece. But really, we have tried to, as I mentioned, incorporate sustainability throughout, and that, from the very beginning, that was fundamental to our approach. And right now, what we're focusing on is basically, legacies. We call them legacies, which are, a set of successes that we've had in the GeoClim tools and so on are part of it, that we, basically can ensure that those are owned and housed within, the institutions that we're working with, so that they can carry on this work once Prepared is ended. But I don't know. That's some of those are mission-related questions that are, hard to answer. Oh, absolutely.
So HughesNet, Severe, these are already institutions that are providing climate services. So what's different because they're part of this collaboration than if Prepared hadn't existed?
So the difference is that the tools and the products are specifically tailored to meet the needs of the Lake Victoria Basin, particularly, and then the organizations that are, within that geographic area. So it's, it's very tailored products as opposed to a, a broader array of, of service provision. Yeah.
Okay, I saw some time. So maybe Chris, and then were there other hands over here? Okay, some repeat customers. So we'll start with Chris. Someone online as well.
Hey, John. So sorry, I feel like we're just kind of hammering you on some stuff but because I was kind of struggling with the same kind of issues as you went through your presentation. Sorry, Chris Perrine. I'm the chief of party for Atlas. I'm not sure I quite. I feel like there was a slide that may have answered this question, but I'm not sure. Are there products that are the result of information from these different partners that are that underprepared or somehow being collected so that you're providing a product that the individual partners don't already provide? I know that the products are being tailored to the needs of the users in the Lake Victoria Basin, but I guess the question is how is the whole greater than the sum of the parts here? Other than just trying to, and other than Tetra Tech underprepared, trying to get these organizations more focused on providing demand-driven products to users who are demanding those products. Are there products that are like the combination of CHIRPS data that USGS is providing and some product that Severe provides, and somehow that's being mixed in together into a product that some user is demanding? Does that make sense?
Some of the parts kind of, yeah.
so to clarify, all the products and tools that I mentioned, these are prepared specific products and tools that were not developed prior to the prepared project. So, for example, GeoClim and those FuseNet USGS supported tools that I mentioned, which of course are very relevant and applicable beyond the context of prepared in the Lake Victoria Basin, but those were developed as part of prepared, and they were developed, essentially by trying to understand what the users wanted, where the gaps were, and what types of tools could help to fulfill those gaps and needs. But these aren't tools that were already in place before prepared started. These are things that were specifically developed to address prepared related needs and activities. Does that address? Somewhat, but I'll give others. Okay.
I think we have some questions online now we're going to switch to, and then hold yours.
So we have someone online asking, can you tell us more about the vulnerability mapping? How did the indicators and provide maps? How are they used?
So for the vulnerability mapping, as I mentioned, the indicators are selected by the stakeholders. So in the case of, I think that I'll pull it up here again. All right, give me a minute. Next one. One more. Oh. Ah. Sorry. There we go. Okay. So this example here came out of our ecosystem profile assessment, which brought together representatives from the partner states, ministries of environment, and others, and they basically, through again a series of participatory workshops, sat together and decided which indicators were most appropriate for this exercise. And as part of the ecosystem profile assessment, there was ground truthing of the information. I mentioned earlier the community-based climate change adaptation assessments, which were one of the mechanisms to ensure that what is displayed here on the maps aligns with what communities and sort of local organizations are seeing on the ground. But the selection of indicators and this tool, it has to be participatory, and it can't be a static tool with fixed indicators, or at least that's not the way that we've approached this. I mentioned that Season, they were the ones who really provided the leadership and the technical training for the development and rollout of this mapping tool.
Okay, we have a follow-up over here from Jeff.
Direct follow-up on that. So similar to the previous question, and I think along the lines of what Ken was asking before, so the indicators and the way this VI mapping worked, it was based on the ministers of environment or the states saying, hey, we would like maps on these ecosystems. So once you provided this product, were there any decisions or investments that this actually informed?
Really good question. So the ecosystem profile assessment that I mentioned that utilized this tool, this helped to identify ecosystem hotspots. And so we selected, I think it was throughout the Lake Victoria Basin, I think we selected 8 ecosystem hotspots where prepared would focus its efforts and particularly focus, activities around improving management plans, improving on-site, implementation to address, some of the, specific issues related to, vulnerability. So you know, in that sense, it was a decision support tool which helped to facilitate, you know, the selection and implementation of interventions that could be implemented in the sites, as well as where to focus.
Okay, who's next, Greg?
Greg Michaels. Thanks, John. I'll give you a chance. You've been battered with questions, so I wanted you to unpack the value added, you know, indication you gave, value added products and the importance of that in some way. Either what was the highest value added product, or what was the value of that value added product, or was it valuable because you were getting standard kinds of products and tools to people who didn't know about it or use it before, or did you create something that didn't exist before? But I'm just trying to add some meat to your value added note. Thanks.
So I would say the value add, the most representative value added product would be GeoClim and the associated tools, and really, you know, the whole idea of gridded data sets, which, you know, through Prepared and the support of HughesNet USGS, we really addressed you know, significant needs related to improved and more reliable data. And, you know, that tool, you know, the creation of it, which, you know, is now being used elsewhere outside of Prepared, I mean, it's been something that I think has been, you know, a significant accomplishment.
Leif Kenberg with Tetra Tech. John, I just wanted to, I think this is really important and an interesting example, and I wanted to comment on how it's also, the work that Prepared has done has been used by the WREDI project, which you mentioned. The WREDI team, through actually RSCMRD, has led a multi-phased vulnerability index mapping very similar to this in the two watersheds that you mentioned. They brought together about 25 different institutions, I think it was 20 or 25 institutions, from TMA to the basin staff that came up with these different indicators and really selected them. Were the ones that went in and actually just said, this is the right indicator for the analysis that we need, for the results that we want, and how we want to actually apply this. And so RCMRD, now being a regional institution and the severe focal point, has done a fantastic job of using this information to then train people from throughout the region, and particularly throughout Tanzania, in the example from WREDI, that I think is going to have a really strong lasting impact moving forward. The basin boards for the Wami Ruvu and the Rufiji Basin are both using that analysis to help decide how they move forward with their interventions and their integrated water resources management plan implementation. And so I think it is, the impact is certainly playing out in Tanzania at the moment through those basins.
Yeah, and I mean, just to add to that, I mean, thanks, Lee. You know, I mentioned Malawi, and, you know, Malawi is another example where RCMRD with, you know, VI mapping, due to, you know, a specific request, you know, they have supported, you know, training and the rolling out of that process in Malawi. And, you know, RCMRD, like these other institutions, they are still going to be there at the end of Prepared, and they now own this product and are really proud of it, and, you know, and are helping, you know, others that are demanding it to, you know, support them. So it's, yeah, it's been a very interesting example.
Okay, we still have some time for questions. So we have Kevin and then Ken again.
Hi, Kevin Coffey from USAID. So I work partly on the Severe project, and one thing that we've been really pushing now is for each product to have strong M&E, sort of to understand that pathway towards sustainability and sort of have that documented and know how close we're getting. And I'm curious, in your experience, have you guys, you know, sort of what methods have you used in terms of M&E to do that, and sort of if you have any advice for us as we give it a shot? Thanks.
So as part of the QSIP process, there's an M&E basically built into that to provide the feedback loops of how things are going, what things need to change. It's really kind of an adaptive management process, and I'll share with you what QSIP looks like and how that M&E piece fits into it. But yeah, it's a very important thing to incorporate.
I think maybe just to add that one of the challenges always with USAID projects and many development projects is tracking post-project, and I guess that's going to be a big question in this case. Just kind of pulling back some of the earlier questions, a lot of this is trying to build capacity for longer-term results and to see whether these institutions really internalize some of the work that you've done and the approaches you've developed. So it will be interesting to see how much there's opportunities to go back and continue to evaluate or check. That's not possible within the confines of this project, but it would seem like a really important piece that somebody needs to kind of look at a little down the road. So okay, next, other questions? Ken, sorry, you were next.
Yeah, so I guess a lot of the questions are centered around the same theme, which is the theory of change, in essence. So I guess, in these big regional projects, of which USAID has many, that are mainly creating data and tools and decision support tools, and in your case, in prepared working explicitly with regional organizations, how do you figure out what you get? How do you figure out what the impact is? So I guess my question is, given now that the project's more or less wrapping up, how would you change the theory of change to add some sort of additional, deeper outcome that you could produce that says we actually want to make sure it does something? If we produce a fantastic tool and there are 2 people in the agency who use it and then they disappear because they get hired away, what have we done? So how do you take it one more step deeper? That seems to be what a lot of people are asking.
Well, I don't think the situation is as drastic as but I guess that what would be, and I think Waridi is a really good example of it, what would facilitate the theory of change would be alignment with bilateral programming to ensure that the work that's being done at that regional transboundary level can also be taken up by those programs and projects that are really focusing much more on the ground implementation. So that's a sort of programmatic approach that I think could potentially be taken. And prepared, Waridi is one example, but prepared tried to sort of couple those 2 levels. But it has to be, it has to be across scale. And, the mandate of, as I mentioned in my first or second slide, the mandate of a regional program is to, operate at that, transboundary level. We all, have experiences where, a regional program and the bilateral, if there's too much kind of action happening related to implementation in one specific country, sometimes there's sensitivities by the bilateral. So there is that tension. But if there's a way to facilitate the across-scale implementation, to align it with those those projects that are really focusing at implementation at the bilateral and country level, I think that that could be an effective programmatic approach.
New question or?
Thank you. Thanks so much. This might be a different and perhaps easier question. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why this area. Did you see kind of certain gaps or opportunities for this kind of programming? And then looking to the future for new geographies, would you be looking at countries that could kind of take on this kind of program, if they would have kind of the same capacity, similar GDPs, or could this be applied in situations with less capacity and less resources? If you could talk a little bit about the broader application. Thanks.
Just to clarify, specifically as it relates to climate services? You know, I think that, yeah, I mean, I think it's an approach, and I think that the tools and the products that, you know, we've been talking about here they are applicable regardless of the region. I think that the capacity issue, that's always a fundamental question. However, you know, the capacity of some of these regional institutions, and particularly some of the meteorological departments, it was quite limited in many cases, and definitely varied across the 5 countries that we worked in. I mean, you know, Burundi, for example, you know, the capacity there is, you know, going to be quite different than what you're going to find in Rwanda. So, you know, in that sense, I think it's a good example of how you can operate across these, you know, varying degrees of capacity, degrees of sort of context, both biophysical and socioeconomic. But I do think it is some, you know, the tools especially are things that could be applied regardless of kind of, you know, geographic setting and institutional setting. There just one more thing. There has to be a willingness, though, by the institutions to, you know, to see this as something that they really want to embrace.
Thanks. I'm Terry Hill. I've got on the boards of two things: the Passive House Institute and the eMERGE Alliance. The Passive House Institute is very energy efficient buildings, and the eMERGE is pushing direct current. So when you put those two together, you've got a pretty energy efficient model for. So I'm sitting here wondering whether this is a, you know, you're working with data and putting it into models that can be tied into the internet and all that. We took this standard and adapted it for the U.S. by climate zone, and we used DOE's BOP software. How could we adapt this standard, this building standard, for Africa?
Maybe a little outside the bounds. Not your field, right?
Yeah, I covered this, right? we didn't cover that. Yeah, I don't know if you have.
Interesting question. Not my area either, but maybe afterwards when we wrap up, somebody here might have some thoughts for you from the group. Anybody else have questions? We have a few minutes, or we can wrap. But were there any others, Danielle?
I have a really easy question for you. This is Danielle Miley from USAID. I was just curious which funding from USAID funding sources were used for the project.
So it was adaptation funding, biodiversity funding, and WASH funding. So it was very much an integrated program also as it relates to funding streams. And so adaptation was 50%. So $23.2 million project. We got a costed modification which bumped the ceiling up, I think, to $27 million. Of that, 50% of it is adaptation funding, 25 biodiversity, and 25 WASH.
Okay, last chance, Celine.
I'm just curious. So I work in climate services, and everyone talks about demand driven now. It's like everything has to be demand driven. I'm curious what you think of, like, what about blue sky ideas, you know, that people wouldn't have thought of, and do you think that is there within QSIP, or is there opportunities for that? Or?
Yeah, I think there has to be room for innovation, and you know, what is being demanded may not necessarily be the best current or in the future, you know, tool or product that could be available. So, you know, in QSIP, whether kind of innovation and creativity and so on is a fundamental part, I think maybe tangentially, but you know, I think that, you know, the demand-driven aspect has to be coupled with sort of this emphasis on innovating and creating things that are new that perhaps aren't currently in demand, but could address, you know, specific issues and challenges and concerns that maybe even the users themselves haven't identified?
That's a great question, Kevin, and it's not just because we work together. That's a great question.
Hi, it's Matthew Edwards with Tetra Tech. I guess just kind of like on the CUSIP question and the innovation. I mean, these questions on like these regional projects and are they value added? Should you just be doing bilateral? I mean, I think at least our experience on Prepared and then in West Africa and on Severe and at least on WABIC thus far is like it's really this like fundamental combination of like innovation, you know, real technical expertise, like some of the stuff that CSIM provided, and then this real organizational capacity building, you know, measure like CUSIP, like, you know, OPI. I mean, there's so many great tools out there to really help organizations really, you know, not only do they find out what their customers want, but like how can they actually like provide that service? Like you can just give them the tool and then they're just going to fall flat on their face because they have no management capacity to actually provide it. So there is a lot of just like real elbow grease that has to go into that, and I think that, you know, I think as these regional programs continue to evolve, I think that's a critical aspect of them. It's just not having it be a technological solution. There's a real organizational capacity, you know, building measure to that must be included on any technical area, wildlife trafficking, you know, climate services, whatever it is, if we think about it regionally.
Yeah, I mean, just to add on that point, and this relates to why regional programs do add value, is that in this context and in many others, we're talking about resources and issues that cross boundaries. I mean, when we're talking about the Lake Victoria Basin, it's a hydrological boundaries inevitably cross borders, and you have to take a regional approach, a transboundary approach to really get at the issues. But, you know, as I'm talking about, it has to be coupled with something that really can support the implementation in the site-specific areas and working across levels. But I think that, you know, regional programs, when they're transboundary issues, are incredibly important.
Okay, I think we might pull this to a close unless there's any final burning questions. You can grab John afterwards, but yeah, I mean, I think, John, you've handled a lot of challenging questions well. It's certainly a very tough area to be working in for those of us who work on it as well. I think both this whole set of issues around climate services generally, and this balance between demand and supply, but then taking it to this regional dimension and trying to find both the sustainability and the linkages with ongoing activities on the ground. I think this is really tough stuff. So really good to hear about all the work that Prepared's been doing, and thanks for, let's thank John for his presentation. And so again, thanks for coming, and no meeting in August. Please come back in September, and please stay for some snacks. Thanks for coming.